fighting that the United States was trying to introduce there. You probably served with him too. Yeah. Right? So going through that thick landscape. And this is a shot that I took in 2008. This is about on what was then the Ho Chi Minh Trail, about 5 miles from the Laotian border up in the Central Highlands. So again, thinking about the Agent Orange and thinking about what was there. Again, we talked a little bit about the two kinds of missions that Ranch Hand was running. On the one hand, doing the crop destruction. And overwhelmingly, Agent Orange was not used for crop destruction, although it was used from time to time. It was primarily used, Agent Blue was primarily used for crop destruction. Agent Orange was molar defoliant. But again, 62% of the total volume of herbicides used in Southeast Asia made up of Agent Orange. But the other ones that were used early on, pink, green, purple, did have 2,4,5-T as part of it. Agent White was a little bit different. That had picloram in it. Didn't have 2,4,5-T, but was often used as a substitute for Agent Orange. And then Agent Blue was the desiccant. It was a drying agent. That's why it was primarily used for crop destruction. Those of you who were there know Ranch Hand, and you know that one of their big mottos was they kind of took Smokey the Bear and turned him on his ear a little bit, so it was no longer only you can prevent a forest fire, it was only you can prevent a forest. We're going to use the herbicides to actually destroy the forest and alter the landscape itself. So here's some shots of the C-123s, again coming in really low over the landscape, flying very slow, making them nice targets for the NLF. Here's a shot down in the Khao Mau Peninsula, way down in the southern tip of Vietnam, about a month or so after a defoliation mission would have taken place. So usually it took a couple weeks, depending on the conditions at the time, for the defoliation to really kick in, but that's about what it would look like after it was sprayed repeatedly. And here you've got a before and after of crop destruction. I don't know exactly where this took place, but you can see fields that have been sprayed pretty heavily on the right versus something you can see a little bit of brown on the tops of those bushes on the left. And then here's the shot I was referring to earlier, doing the base perimeter spraying, and these guys out goofing around spraying each other. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard from veterans who said that they were out there dousing each other in this stuff. And unlike the Ranch Hand pilots, who would have been regularly exposed to Agent Orange, most of these guys out in the field, and I assume that means a lot of you as well, we're not going back to base at night. We're not showering and rinsing off at night, and we're not sleeping inside at night. Those guys that were out in the field regularly at forward bases, doing defoliation around that perimeter, and being exposed to some of these herbicides on a regular basis without rinsing them off and taking what could have been safety precautions at the time, would not have been in nearly as safe a place as some of those Ranch Hand pilots. We have decent records on the C-123 missions. We have decent flight records on helicopter missions and decent records on where these herbicides were stored in Southeast Asia. What we don't have good records on are things like this, about how and why they were used in and around bases on a more informal and ad hoc basis. So, again, thinking back to why herbicides, why would this have been a popular weapon of choice at the time in the early 1960s? Well, part of it is that these were really being used very widely at the time as domestic herbicides. They were being used in agriculture, just like pesticides. They were being used to clear roadsides and telephone wire paths, railroad tracks, all throughout the western United States, all throughout Australia and New Zealand, and quite a bit throughout Western Europe as well. And so before the war really kicks in with the arrival of troops in '65, overwhelming majority of these herbicides are being used domestically for different kinds of domestic purposes. After 1965, the Pentagon becomes by far the largest consumer of herbicides. And so by the time we get into 1968, right around the time of Tet, we've got basically a global worldwide shortage of 2,4,5-T because there are so many herbicides being devoted to the war in Vietnam. But these were very common herbicides being used throughout the United States. Those same policymakers who were making decisions to weaponize these tactical herbicides in South Vietnam would have been using the same herbicides on their lawns, on the White House lawn, and all their resort homes as well. So, what did the government know and when did they know it? The Kennedy administration spent a lot of time in these early years of the war, as Kennedy was increasing the number of advisors and special forces in country, discussing these, but they did not discuss health concerns. They did not concern the effects that these herbicides would have on humans. They discussed essentially the politics of herbicide usage. They were worried that this would look bad. They were worried that it would be a PR problem, that the Vietnamese and the Chinese and the Soviets would essentially do as they did during the Korean War, charge that this was chemical warfare and make a lot of hay out about it in the press. So the discussions that the Kennedy administration is having, 1961, 62, 63, are really about the fallout from the use of these herbicides. They are not concerned about the health effects of these. And why? Because there was very limited knowledge at that point in the late 50s and early 60s about the effects of these herbicides on humans. And part of the story of Agent Orange is that the lifespan of Agent Orange from the early 1960s to the early 1970s is also the story of the rise of the environmental movement in the United States. It's also the rise of our scientific knowledge about 2,4,5-T, about the effects of herbicides, pesticides, and other chemicals on the human body and on the environment. So it's during the same time that Agent Orange is being used so widely in South Vietnam that we, as a people, come to understand so much more about it and its effects. So how many of you remember the DDT trucks going around in the 50s and 60s, spraying trees, spraying fruits, going right down suburban American neighborhood blocks and spraying those pesticides all throughout the neighborhoods? How many of you remember the phrase better living through chemistry? Right? In the 1950s, chemicals were not the enemy. We didn't think about these things the same way that we do in the 1980s and 1990s and today, right? You all remember the movie The Graduate, right? What's the future? Plastics. Plastics was going to be the future. We weren't thinking about the relationship between all those chemicals that we were putting into our food, putting into our water, putting out into the world, and what effects they might have on human health down the road. So that's the government. And what did the government know and when did they know it? And trust me, I spent 10 years looking for every smoking gun I could find, early evidence in the Kennedy administration prior to 1960 or 1967 about the effects of these herbicides, and there is none to be found in the Pentagon, in the White House, in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, no evidence whatsoever that those folks knew that these things were going to be potentially harmful for human health. The chemical companies are a different story, okay? And what you've got here is a shot of the dioxin molecule. So what we learned later on, what the chemical companies knew early on, going back to at least the 1950s into the late 1940s, was that when they were making 2,4,5-T, the active ingredient, one of the two active ingredients in Agent Orange and a lot of those other rainbow herbicides, is that you could not produce that herbicide without also producing dioxin. And there's about 100 different kinds of dioxin that are out there in the world. And this one, this molecule that you're seeing here, is 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, or TCDD for short. And it is easily the most deadly and the most dangerous of that family of dioxins. And what chemical companies like Dow and Monsanto, Diamond Hercules, all the folks who made Agent Orange knew early on was that you could not produce 2,4,5-T without also producing dioxin. Now, there was a range of knowledge about what the effects of different levels of dioxin in those herbicides would have, what effects they would have on lab animals and on human health and on the environment down the road. And that knowledge developed quite a bit again during the 1960s. But we have good evidence that the chemical companies knew early on. What we don't have is evidence that they told the Pentagon anything about it. So, throughout the 1960s then, this knowledge base is evolving, and starting in about 1966 or 67, the Bionetics Laboratory and the National Academy of Sciences put their best scientists on this, and people began looking very closely at herbicides, pesticides, and things like 2,4,5-T. The instrumentation that they're using in their studies is getting a lot better, so we can detect parts per million, later on parts per billion, later on parts per trillion, and our understanding of the risks associated with those things grows as we learn more and more about these things and are able to detect them. And we start finding dioxins in all sorts of different places. Dow Chemical Company from right here in Midland, Michigan, which was one of the biggest producers of Agent Orange, comes up with a study in the mid-1960s showing that because there is some form of dioxin in smoke produced from fire, that really there's no more danger in something like Agent Orange than there is in a campfire, because dioxin can be produced through that kind of a process as well. And so as a result of growing concerns about the effects of these, not just on the Vietnamese, not just on our troops who were serving in Vietnam, but about the effects of the domestic uses of things like 2,4,5-T, the Nixon administration gradually comes to suspend the sale and the production of 2,4,5-T in the United States. It phases out the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, and by 1971, it ends Operation Ranch Hand. Other countries like Canada or Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand don't ban 2,4,5-T in most cases until several years later. But as a result of some of the other environmental movements and the activism that's going on in the United States in the 1960s and early 70s, the U.S., in a lot of ways, acts fairly quickly to actually suspend the use of this. But, of course, the war is still very much going on at that point. So, okay. So go back to the question then of where was this stuff used? So this map probably looks familiar to those of you who were there. We'll zoom in on the south. So where do you suppose, or for those of you who already know, where was the majority of Agent Orange sprayed during the war? Anybody know? Anybody want to hazard a guess?
Loch
Ninh, okay. Where else, sir?
Tay Ninh Province.
Tay Ninh Province, absolutely. Up there towards the Parrot's Beak? Sure.
Mekong Delta.
Say that again?
Mekong Delta.
Down in the Mekong Delta, absolutely. Some of those shots we saw earlier, that defoliation shot was from
About the Quang Tri Province.
Quang Tri Province, absolutely. Up near the DMZ.
All along Korea.
All along Highway 1. Where else?
Korea.
Absolutely, and used in Korea about the same time too, actively used in the Korean DMZ around 67, 68. So when I'm teaching my students about this, one of the things we talk about quite a bit is the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And here's not a great map, but a decent map of the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the different jumping off points from that trail that the North Vietnamese would use for delivery throughout the war. And if you match that up with what we know about the spray missions, and here's an example of a jumping off point again near the Laotian border, and then match that up with this map, and this is a map from 65 to 71 of the active defoliation mission. So this doesn't include crop destruction, but the areas on the map here that you see are in dense red, especially up here. You'll see if the laser pointer works. So somebody said Tay Ninh Province, right up near the Cambodian border, up in Quang Tri Province, just south of the DMZ and between Quang Tri, Hue and Da Nang, up there in those central highlands. Right about here is where I took that photo I just showed you. Those densely red areas are the areas where the greatest amount of Agent Orange was sprayed. And a lot of those areas weren't just sprayed once, sprayed repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. So if you match those up all together, you can get a sense of where the most heavily sprayed areas of Vietnam were. And although the Kennedy administration really saw herbicides early on as a substitute for manpower, we don't want to send in troops, so we're going to use herbicides. We're going to use electronic surveillance. We're going to use all these things in lieu of troop movements. They never thought initially that they would be using herbicides and American troops at the same time. But as Johnson escalates the war beginning in 1964 and 65, the herbicide missions only get ratcheted up along with the number of troops who are in Vietnam. So the heaviest years of herbicide spraying in Vietnam are 1967, and then it declines just a little bit into 1968, and those are the years that coincide with the peak numbers of U.S. troops serving in country. So if you go back to Vietnam today and look at that map, anybody want to hazard a guess as to where the most polluted areas of Vietnam today are? There's areas throughout Vietnam that have high levels of dioxin still in the soil and still in the food supply.
Tay Ninh Province.
Tay Ninh Province, area where it was sprayed quite a bit. Other guesses? Quang Tri. So for years, decades, after the war was over, doctors, scientists, epidemiologists assumed, because this was logical with what we knew about dioxin and its lifespan at the time, we assumed that the most heavily contaminated areas of Vietnam would be the areas that were sprayed repeatedly over and over again. But in fact, that's not the case. People started looking in those areas, looking in Quang Tri, looking in Tay Ninh, looking along the Cambodian border and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and those are not the areas that were coming back with high residues. Those are not the areas in the villages where dioxin was showing up in tissue samples from animals, birds, breast milk from nursing mothers. So what people started doing was what environmental historians are taught to do, which is follow the molecule, see where this stuff was, where it was used, and simply kind of recreate the path. And so if we do that, we go back and trace the barrels that Agent Orange was shipped in, We can trace it back in the origins to the United States. So we have Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan. We have several companies in New Jersey and throughout the St. Louis region who were producing Agent Orange. All of the Agent Orange used in Vietnam was produced in the United States. It would then be shipped by rail down to places like Gulfport, Mississippi, and down into Texas along the Gulf Coast, shipped through the Panama Canal and then across the Pacific Ocean on big freighters over to Vietnam, and unloaded primarily in Saigon, Bien Hoa area, and then also Da Nang. Taken out on the air bases, particularly Bien Hoa and Da Nang, which were the two largest air bases used in support of Agent Orange, taken out to the tankers that would then be used to fuel the trucks. And you can already begin to see the spillage all over the tarmac out there. And in places like Bien Hoa, they actually put together these big water tower-like structures, one blue, one white, one orange for Agent Orange, Agent Blue, and Agent White. But the thing that we have to pay attention to is where these barrels were. And of course, the Army being the Army, the Air Force being the Air Force, had good regulations, right, for what you were supposed to do with these barrels. Empty them out, rinse, put them on the drying rack, rinse them out again, let them dry, ship them back to where they could be either repurposed or recycled. But as with a lot of Army and Air Force policies, what it said on paper wasn't necessarily how those policies were carried out in reality. So you can see these barrels that are out there stacked in that kind of salty, tropical, humid South Vietnamese air, and they are beginning to rust, and they are beginning to deteriorate. Here's a shot from Bien Hoa Air Base, leaking out into the soil. Bien Hoa Air Base, barrels after barrels after barrels. You can do the math. If we talk about 20 million gallons of herbicide, 62% of which was Agent Orange, most of which had 2,4,5-T in it, times 55-gallon drums that they were shipped in, that's a lot of barrels. Anybody ever tried to actually empty a 55-gallon drum of anything? Not always easy to get that last little bit out of the bottom, is it? Even if you're paying close attention. So there's a lot of herbicide left in those barrels when you start adding them up. And instead of being rinsed and repeated and rinsed and dried and repeated and repurposed, a lot of times they get thrown into piles. They get repurposed by the local population to get their diesel fuel and sometimes to carry water back to the villages. And in Da Nang, we just get this huge graveyard of barrels that are just left out to rot, leaking into the soil. So what we begin to notice when we start identifying these dioxin hotspots in the early 1990s is that it's not the areas that were sprayed repeatedly. It's the areas where the herbicides were stored. It's the air bases and special forces bases stacked throughout the country where these herbicides were stored, where they leaked into the soil, they get into the soil, they get into the food chain, and they remain in the food chain for a long time. And that's what contributes to the long-term health effects and the high dioxin levels that we're still seeing in and around places like Da Nang and Bien Hoa. So we have to follow the barrels. And of course, when we start looking at where the barrels were, where they were shipped, where they were stored, where this stuff was tested, not just from 1961 to 71, but for the years before the Vietnam War, for the years after the Vietnam War, that's when we start hearing things like Korea, as the gentleman in the back said, Okinawa, Guam, Thailand, New Zealand, India, parts of Europe, all the different places where it was produced and stored and tested in the United States, like Eglin Air Force Base, like Fort Detrick, Maryland, right out of DC. That's where we begin to see the hot spots. So for a long time, and some of you probably encountered this when you came back, said, well, you weren't exposed to Agent Orange. You were in the rear with the gear. You weren't out in the grunt. You weren't out in the muck. You were back on the base. In some cases, and it would depend, of course, on your individual experience, the base could have been just as dangerous for your long-term health as being out in the jungle. So when veterans start coming home in the 1970s, and you'll be shocked to hear this, but some of the VA folks weren't exactly receptive to the stories that the healthcare effects that they were seeing were caused by Agent Orange. Veterans were initially asked to prove that they were exposed to Agent Orange and prove exactly where they were on a particular day based on flight records that were sometimes incomplete about when those C-123s went over. So it's based on a faulty model in a lot of different ways. But the point here, and the point of the book in a lot of ways, was that the initial burden of proof was on veterans to show that they were exposed to Agent Orange, and then to show a direct link between that exposure to a variety of health conditions, which especially in the late 1970s were still not very well defined because we didn't have enough science and we didn't have enough long-term data. This is where we get into the veterans class action suit, which was launched in 1977 and 78 against the chemical companies and the U.S. government, and was later settled in the mid-1980s, which created at the time, seemed like a lot of money, but when you consider the number of troops who were in that class action lawsuit, it doesn't shake out to a lot for every family. $182 million from the chemical companies created in that trust fund for veterans. But as part of the settlement, which is very common in these type of class action lawsuits, this, by the way, was the largest class action suit in U.S. history to that point. As part of the settlement, the chemical companies admitted no blame and did not stipulate, in fact, that Agent Orange 245T or the dioxin in 245T was to blame for the health concerns that were being experienced by veterans. And since that point, every single legal case that has been brought against the chemical manufacturers of Agent Orange, with one exception in a Korean court, which they have been unable to enforce the ruling of, every single case since then has been thrown out for a lack of scientific evidence. And so part of what is going on here, and part of the argument that I make in the book, is that ultimately this is really about politics. As much as I'm interested in questions of science and history as a historian, the decisions that get made and the change that we see in the benefits available to veterans experiencing the results of Agent Orange change quite a bit over time because of politics, because of political pressure, because of, at times, a very effective veterans lobby, and because a change in the mindset. And instead of saying, you veteran who served in Vietnam, you need to prove to us that you were exposed and that that exposure led directly to your condition that you're experiencing. That mindset changes quite a bit over the course of the 1980s. So by the time we get to the Agent Orange Act of 1991, the burden of proof has been completely reversed. And since that point, it is now the official stance of the U.S. government that any U.S. soldier who set foot in South Vietnam between 1961 and now it's actually 1975, we presume that you were exposed to Agent Orange. It doesn't matter where you served, it doesn't matter when you were there within that time frame, it doesn't matter how long you were there. Although if anybody's any Blue Water Navy vets in the room, anybody know a Blue Water Navy vet, okay? So there's still some very arbitrary distinctions between who served in country and who served just off the coast of the country. And so the experience that the Blue Water vets have had trying to get some of these same conditions realized has been a little bit different. But the Agent Orange Act of 1991 says that anybody who was in Vietnam during that period is now presumed to have been exposed to Agent Orange. The decision also was removed to a certain degree from places like the Center for Disease Control or the National Institute of Health, which was very active in crafting the service-related policies during the 1980s. Now it's up to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to make up the final decision about what does and does not constitute a service-related benefit. What conditions? Still informed by science, still informed by different scientific studies, but it's ultimately a policy decision made by a political appointee who eventually makes that determination. Okay? And so when you look on the list today, and I imagine there's some folks today who are covered maybe 100% by some of these things, and look at the different conditions that are now covered. Service-related disabilities because of a suggested or a limited or a very clear demonstrable link to Agent Orange exposure. As long as you were in Vietnam during that time, and as long as you have that condition today, you should be able to, and you should be receiving benefits for those conditions. And this gets us into some really interesting questions if you're interested in from an academic standpoint. When we look at, so here I'll give you the VA official policy on type 2 diabetes and its relationship to Agent Orange. And so if you can't read that, what it says is, presently available data allow for the possibility of an increased risk of type 2 diabetes in Vietnam veterans. It must be noted, however, that these studies indicate that the increased risk, if any, from herbicide or dioxin exposure appears to be small. The known predictors of diabetes risk, family history, physical inactivity, obesity, continue to greatly outweigh any suggested increased risk from wartime exposure to herbicides. So part of what the VA and the scientists who are informing the VA are saying here is essentially Agent Orange, if you were exposed to it, probably didn't cause your diabetes. But that doesn't matter. Those are legitimately academic questions for people like me to be interested in at some other kind of abstract level. From a policy standpoint, from a political standpoint, and most importantly from a benefits standpoint, it doesn't matter. If you were there, we presume you were exposed to exposed to Agent Orange. And if you've got something like type 2 diabetes that the VA now recognizes as having even a limited or suggestive link, then you should be able to get your benefits from that. So as we continue to grow and develop, and I'll end on this slide, the knowledge about the long-term effects of 2,4,5-T, Agent Orange, dioxin exposure, continues to grow. We continue to learn more and more about the long-term effects of these. So, veterans who did serve in the DMZ in Korea during 1967-68, where this stuff was sprayed, stored, and tested, are now covered. Blue water vets, as I mentioned, are still actively pursuing some of these same things, knowing that they in some ways were just as likely to have been exposed to elements of Agent Orange as others, not just brown water vets and other folks who physically served in country at the time. A lot of activity recently around those C-123s, many of which remained very active and used in a lot of different ways after the war in Vietnam is over. Last spring, people were actively engaged in this study, and over the last couple of months, they've shown significant dioxin residues long-term, even to this day, long after the war was over in those C-123s, and they're now looking at expanding benefits for veterans, pilots, folks who served in those C-123s well after. And actually, I didn't even know about this till I started working with Dick on some of these town halls. But there are folks who are actively exploring the link between bladder cancer and Agent Blue, not Agent Orange, but Agent Blue. So a lot of what we know about these chemicals and their long-term effects is still evolving, but they're still going to be subject to the same kind of politics and policy decisions that have been made over the last 20 years. And Dick and others, I'm sure, will be well more equipped to talk about some of the specific benefits and policy questions. So I just want to say I'll stop there, and we can have some discussion, some Q&A, and I'll let Dick take over as well. But I just want to say thanks so much for having me, and be happy to stick around and chat for a while.
Where's the lights, please?
Science, the long-term effects of these herbicides, dioxin, 2,4,5-T, Agent Orange, is in the area of birth defects. There is only one birth defect that's currently covered by the VA specifically connected to Agent Orange, and the name is escaping me right now. If anybody knows what it is.
Spina bifida.
Spina bifida, thank you. Spina bifida is the only fully recognized birth defect recognized for Vietnam veterans as directly linked to Agent Orange. There's been a lot of this, especially in Vietnam, about the long-term effects and birth defects and long-term congenital deformations from 2,4,5-T and Agent Orange. But the area, particularly for male veterans who served in Vietnam and what the long-term birth defects are potentially for them, there's really a lack of scientific consensus. And I went around and talked to the scientists about this, and they walked me through this. And people who I would describe as very sympathetic and trying to do whatever they can to extend benefits for Vietnam veterans will still tell you that the birth defects are by far the hardest ones to demonstrate, even a limited suggestive link along the lines of what we looked at with the diabetes link. Yeah, way in the back.
Yeah, what happens if a couple children, okay,
Mm-hmm.
is going to have kids?
Mm-hmm.
They tried and tried and tried, and nothing's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Does that go back to this?
A lot of people think it does, and there have been a lot of scientists and doctors who have looked at that study over time. There was no conclusive evidence along those lines for impotence or for other kinds of birth defects other than spina bifida when they did the original long-term ranch hand study, which is limited in its own way, but still one of the longer-term studies that we have. So even in that area, there's nothing clearly linked to inability to conceive or infertility problems, particularly for male veterans who served in Vietnam, and infertility problems along those lines. Female veterans, nurses and others who served in Vietnam have had some success in getting some disability-related benefits for infertility, but not so much for male veterans who served in Vietnam.
What is the role of the geneticist play?
That's a really good question. Again, I get into dangerous ground here. I didn't do well in high school biology and chemistry, and I didn't take any past that point. But what some folks have looked at, and again, the best research in this in a lot of ways, even though it's limited in some ways, is in places like Vietnam, where we're seeing third, fourth, fifth generation effects on the ground. But there we know that it's still actively dioxin in the food chain, which is different than, say, a 5th generation or 4th generation, maybe, Vietnam veteran, grandchildren, or great-grandchild at this point. So they are looking at genetic malformations, but this goes back to the still evolving nature of how we know about how dioxin works. We used to think that just exposure mattered, and then we learned that, well, the size of the dose matters. And then we learned, well, the size of the dose doesn't matter as much as the timing of the dose. What we do know very clearly is that fetuses or young children who are exposed to the dioxin molecule, especially TCDD, are far more vulnerable than older folks who are more developed and are exposed to it later on. So this is why pregnant women are particularly vulnerable and their fetuses are particularly vulnerable, because it can affect children, and if children are exposed to things like dioxin at an early age, it can have some genetic potential for malformations. But that area is still very much evolving, and I think Trudy Bennett, who's coming to Dick's event in May 9th, is somebody who's much better informed about that stuff than I am, and so Dick might be able to share some resources, some of the more current research on that as well. Sir.
I was a special forces stationed down in Recon.
Mm-hmm.
And my first daughter was born with her arm missing. There were 2 other guys, not in my unit, but in other units, just up in the same region.
Yeah.
And we all were from the same town up there. And their firstborn child were born with birth defects. One was born with no both arms missing, and when we went to the doctor down in that they told us, as of right now, that it was the first of like me. Skip a generation, and then it'd be my daughter just had two kids, and they were okay. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I published the book about 3 years ago now, and I can tell you that barely a week goes by when I don't get a story from a veteran or a widow or a child or a grandchild of a Vietnam veteran with a very similar kind of story, a particular health condition, a birth defect, a lot of different kinds of things. And this is one of those areas where, unfortunately, and it's a very imperfect system, the best system that we've got right now, and it's as generous to Vietnam veterans now as it ever has been since the war ended, and still not good enough in a lot of ways, but it's evolved because we have better long-term data and we have science. And on the question of birth defects, there's just not enough science, not enough data, not enough consistency in that data to point to specific concerns for most of those conditions. The reality is, unfortunately, we live, if we go back and think about that very chemical-laden world in which we live, and in which a lot of us grew up in, not just because we live in the United States, but we